I think the trouble with eating sugary grass is the body has a system for perpetuating a need for sugar. It's a little bit like we say someone's got a sweet tooth. That's controlled, or the appetite of the horse for sugar is controlled by hormones. So the more sugar it has eaten, or the more starchy diet, the more it will crave a starch diet, and you kind of have to train them away from that into something that's a little bit more bitter, because most of these plants are bitter. They're not sweet by any standards, and I think that horses struggle with that. When you've had them on sugar, their hormones are geared to receive sugar, the gut is geared to receive a sugary starch diet, and so you have to recondition them really into accepting other plants. And I think that taking a cutting from the hedgerow, putting it in the stable is probably one of the best ways to do it. Let them just choose to eat what they want, add to it as you want, and try and learn from it really, try and identify the plant and understand what they contain. So we've got here some moss. I think moss is a fantastic thing to add to a mix of plants, simply because it's very huge amounts of antimicrobials, unusual antimicrobials. At the moment, the worry is that antibiotics, horses are antibiotic resistant. Their gut bacteria is also antibiotic resistant. E. coli is a particular concern. It causes quite a few problems, gastrointestinal problems in horses. This has really high amounts of an antimicrobial that your horse may choose to eat simply because he's got gut bacteria or too many of the wrong type of gut bacteria. So it's always a good one to put in. If you can find it attached to a twig, even better, because they will eat the roots around it as well. And then we've got some heather. Actually, that's a wild geranium. Wonderful if you can get wild geranium. That one's quite small because horses have eaten most of them, and it's struggling to come back this year. And next year we'll give the field a holiday, and that should come back very well. So I would definitely include that in there. It's quite sweet tasting.
What's good about the geranium?
The geranium, again, most of these plants are highly antimicrobial. You've got some saponins in there, some very different types of antioxidants that you won't find in bags of horse feed or from vitamin E. They are chemicals that interact with the body, they interact with the signalling compounds of inflammation, and what you'll find is that anything disease that's on its way, starting the onset of a disease, the chemicals in plants such as that will diminish the inflammation and put your horse back to normal, which is fantastic. That's another one. Self-heal. That's actually quite short self-heal. Self-heal will grow much bigger than that. These are quite small at the moment because our horses have eaten them down to the ground. Again, quite bitter, so it's something you can introduce. Almost what I would do with this is actually take the leaves off and chop the leaves up, or maybe just break them, just kind of crush them a little bit, because the horse will probably find it easier then to get at the leaves. It's quite woody underneath. Our horses will rip the roots up and eat that as well. Self-heal is one of those miraculous plants that contain a huge variety of antioxidants. I guess that's why it's called self-heal. Wounds, great for injuries, swellings, soft swellings on legs, great for arthritis. That one, it took our horses a while to actually get in and like that one. This cleavers, we have loads of people come and chat to us about cleavers, or goose grass, I think maybe is its other name. They will eat it. They tend to crush it in the mouths first before actually getting stuck in, and I think that's because the sensation is quite sticky and it's a little bit strange to touch. But once they've got a taste for that, again, if you've never given your horse this to eat, I'd probably cut it up and introduce it in small quantities rather than in a big piece like that. Perhaps disguise it a little bit just until their noses get used to actually putting it in their mouths. Another plant that there is a fair amount of research, not sure how easily you'll find it, is the heather. This contains antioxidants and chemicals that will treat gut ulcers. So it's got compounds in it that will probably a different action to omeprazole. Omeprazole is the compound you find in Gastrogard. This contains a compound that actually doesn't inhibit the proton pump, but it does bind the gut wall. It does make the gut wall stronger. I think it's a fascinating compound. We're working with York University on the extraction process of that from heather, the idea being that we can harvest it quite well in this country. There are areas where we grow a lot of heather, and if we can get a process to extract that compound, it could be a very useful food additive. That's a trefoil, part of the alfalfa family. Again, it's anti-inflammatory. Huge amounts of vitamin E, vitamin C, potassium, calcium. An excellent plant. If you've got that in your meadow, that's brilliant. We've got sweet verbena here. This is a bitter one. Again, if you're going to have this in your mix to introduce, I'd probably choose the small plants and take the leaves off and just mix it in. I'm trying to see if we've got a larger plant, but I think the horses ate it on the way down. It's got a kind of a tall yellow flowered head on it, and they prefer it without the flower. It does belong to the mint family, but it's actually quite a sweet mint. We found with wild mint they won't eat it if it's too bitter, so you've got to make sure you've got a sweet variety. Anything that grows near water is sweeter than things that grow on rocks, which is worth knowing when you're choosing your plants. That's Juncus. It's a really rubbish plant. You'll find it on moorland. It looks as though it's got no value at all whatsoever. It's got brown tufts. Again, I think the horses ate it on the way down the hill. But it's an easy one to spot out on the moorland. But it's incredibly sweet, and it contains huge amounts of sugar. Now, you don't tend to get a whole field of this growing together. It grows in tufts around sort of bogs and on heathland. It's kind of quite tough to eat, so they have to kind of snatch a bit off and then almost take time to chew it, which is a really much better thing than perennial ryegrass that they can gobble up and gorge on. With this, it contains a lot of sugar, but they have to eat it carefully. It is better, I believe. I think it actually contains higher sucrose than fructose, which maybe that's why it's a bit more beneficial than perennial rye. Then we've got the horse superfood, which if you're lucky enough to have some of this, hang on to it. This is Vaccinium. It's a wild blueberry. In this time of the year, it should have small black fruits. Early on in the year, it has flowers. Our horses, we did manage to get this off a rock, so you've got, it's quite tall and quite woody. If they're grazing it, as they would do a grass, it'll be quite small, almost about that size, and quite sweet, and they'll eat the whole thing. You'll just find them munching on the whole thing. Like that, they'll just pick off the little bits at the edge. Huge amounts of vitamin C, strongly anti-inflammatory, contains proanthocyanidins, which are fantastic for joints, and also contains anti-obesity compounds. That really is the superfood of all horse plants. And I don't think it grows all over. I think you have to be in a little bit sort of wild and woody areas to get it to grow, but if you've got some, let me know. It's fantastic stuff. That's a part of a wild bulrush. Again, you may not have that to hand, although if you're walking down the hedgerows, you possibly will find water plants if you've got ditches. I would choose lots of those because the horses really do love to investigate them and to eat them. We found that, again, it's highly anti-inflammatory and anti-obesity. And then we've got a few of these sorrels, which there's some kind of debate with sorrel and some link with docks. They seem to grow together. That's looking a little bit more, as they get taller, they look a little bit more dock leaf-like. The tall docks are poisonous, supposedly, and our horses don't eat them, but they will choose all these varieties of sorrel. The sorrels are very closely linked to the Chenopodium family, which contain anti-obesity compounds as well. They're a little bit bitter, fantastic for introducing your horse to hedgerow plants, a really useful one to include. Some horses will not have anything to do with them, ours do, but we usually find the fattest ones will eat them. The thin ones don't really bother with them. And we're moving on to, we've got all sorts of varieties of moss. Again, we tend to leave the moss in the grass. We don't weed kill any of the moss because it's very strongly antimicrobial, very good for the digestive tract. You'll find that we must have probably 30 varieties. I think we've got a few different varieties in there. And we find that the horse doesn't dislike any of them. They eat them all. They'll eat them off the walls in the winter, and mainly for digestion. So that's another good one to introduce to start with. I don't know, should we move on to the grasses? Is there anything I've missed? That's a stitchwort, very good for wound healing. You'll find that sometimes they'll eat it. I probably wouldn't introduce any kind of rocky plants if you can find them to start with. I'd stick to the sort of green ones. Ours will eat that at various stages through the year, but not really sure why. They're useful to have, certainly in your paddock, but perhaps I wouldn't introduce them into the mix that you're going to put in the stable. Our grass